Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com and available on Pacifica Radio, Progressive Radio Network, iTunes, Stitcher, and more. My guest for this show is a repeat visitor. It's great to have him back. Peter Phillips is professor of political sociology at Sonoma State University. He was the head of Project Censored for many years and the Media Freedom Foundation, and he's the author of numerous books. Now his new book is out, Giants, the Global Elite. It's a big book, a lot of information in it. It lists the most powerful people in the world. Now, I call the show Bottom Up Show because I think we're transitioning from a top down to a more bottom up culture. And I write a lot about it. And one of the things that I believe is that while this is happening, there's going to be a lot of resistance. And the more success that the bottom up movement has with people power, the more resistance there's going to be from the top. And I think in many ways, this book, Giants, the Global Power Elite, is giving us the list in some ways of the enemies of top down. So it's great to have you back on the show, Peter. How are you?
Well, I'm doing pretty good. The university has started classes, so it's the first week of teaching. I don't think of the global elite as the enemy. I'd like to say that. Okay,
go ahead. Well, I wanted to start off because as I read this and I've listened to some of your talks about it, and that's the way I think. I mean, these are the people who are trying to keep the rest of the world down. These are the people who are trying to hold on to their power, consolidate it, and expand it. How is that not the enemy?
Well, they don't think of themselves that way, that's for sure. They certainly think that by growing capital that it will trickle down and benefit the entire world. The problem with that is that they're wrong, and it's not happening that way. 80% of the people in the world live on less than $10 a day. You got half the world living on $3 a day, and a quarter of the world living on $1.25. 30,000 people a day die from starvation. So this is not good, and it's getting worse. And you throw the environmental consequences on top of that, we're in a state of crisis in the world that is unrelenting. And our job in terms of social movement activism, democracy movements, this book is to tell the people who have the power to change it that it's time to make this if they want to see that their grandchildren have grandchildren. So,
and you say, where do I have it? You say these global power elites, the people you specifically identify and describe and give us background about in this book, they're the only ones who can correct our endangered situation. And by endangered, you mean extinction. They're the only one?
Well, they're the only ones that could correct it without massive chaos, environmental extinction, massive wars, deaths of billions of people. Then it would change. But they could prevent a lot of that by redistributing global wealth that reaches everybody in some capacity and keeps people actively engaged and follows as a moral code the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
And I hear you that, and part of your book is a call to these people to take a look at this Universal Code of Human Rights and do something about it. But at the same time, these people are producing the policies that are killing millions of people, who are keeping people in poverty and starvation.
That's true. And that's why it's so important to name them. We named 389 people in this book, very specifically, who they are, where they work, their public wealth, some of their policies. We go into in-depth reviews on some of them. But, we're saying here, and there's a sociology of elites. So Jeff Bezos, who's worth $150 billion, the richest person in the world, he's one big tree in a forest, but he's not the forest. The forest is the sociology, the policy groups, the networks, the people managing global capital who are controlling the world and the way it is run today. And governments and intelligence agencies and the military work to support global capital and their need. And they have to continue to grow, which is this unrelenting growth with a return every year in terms of capital that locks them into this trap of having to continually expand and grow. And they've got more capital than they know what to do with. They have good places to put it.
Wait a second. You just said locks them into this trap.
They're locked into the trap of continuing to have to grow capital to get a return. I mean, we're talking, 200 people that control $50 trillion worth of wealth. I mean, that makes Jeff Bezos look small time. And Bezos, $1 trillion is 1,000 billions. So that's, 600 times Jeff Bezos. And you only have, certain companies like BlackRock have $6 trillion that they're managing. So, that's 6,000 billions that they're investing around the world. They've got more capital than they got other places to return it. So a couple of things happen. One, they'll do speculative investments like the subprime mortgage investments, which almost brought the entire system down. And then they benefit from wars. So we're now in a state of permanent war worldwide with the U.S. military empire taking the lead in NATO and other countries that spend huge amounts of money that profit the global power elite, that profit the investors of global capital. The war, blows things up. You spend money getting ready for it, you use it up, and then you do it again. So it's a major contributor to global war, and it's a major contributor to the privatization of the world. So the
privatization of the world, yeah. Now, I kind of dove right into the middle of this conversation without really doing the beginning I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was get you to tell us the basic idea of the book and what the goal of the book is. So why don't you do it now, and then we can jump back into the conversation.
Well, people from the Occupy movement know about the 99% versus the 1%. The global 1%, if they have over $700,000 in assets, you're in the 1%.
I just got to say one thing. A couple of years ago, I was talking to a young guy in his early 30s. I said, the way you're going to be in the 1% soon. And at the time, it was only like $320,000. It's really exploded. I mean, it's just a couple of years.
Yeah, but the difference between somebody with 700,000 and someone like Jeff Bezos with 150 billion is significant.
Yeah.
And so it's the 1,000th of 1%. It's the top 6,000 or 7,000 people that are at the peak of the global capital. And I identify who are the policy players inside that peak. So we call it the transnational capitalist class. They're people with similar backgrounds, similar education. They live in similar cities, the major cities in the world. And they know each other. And they're interacting together in managing capital. So they have these big transnational investment management companies like BlackRock and Chase Manhattan Bank. Exactly.
I'm showing you a picture of the book of how everybody's connected to everybody else on the video.
Well, not only are they huge amounts, there's 17 companies that have $1 trillion worth of assets that they're managing. We call those the giants. And it's BlackRock, Vanguard, JP Morgan Chase, UBS, Bank of America, Barclays. I mean, there's 17. They collectively control, and this was in 2017, $41 trillion worth of capital, of wealth, of money. This is other people's money, but they're the ones that decide where it's going to go. So they are all invested in each other. So it's one giant cluster of global capital co-invested with each other, looking for returns anywhere in the world that will be give them a 3 to 10% or even higher return. And in a way, they're desperate because there's not enough places. So governments, wars, regime changes, all of that serves their interests.
So you say that the dominant ideological message from corporate media today is that the continued growth of the economy will offer trickle-down benefits to all humans and save the planet. Now,
That's what they believe.
This bundles the idea that the corporate media are the servants of these global elites, and they are basically working to protect capital. And you talk a lot about protecting capital and the role of these organizations, and then their kind of vassal organizations like the U.S. Army and the military-industrial complex and the World Bank and what have you. I mean, you paint a picture that is overwhelming.
Well, yeah, there's capital is global. There's the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the world, different international organizations that are mostly run by governments, with the most powerful governments, most powerful economies having the greatest amount of control and influence. But I'm not interested in them as the sociology of those places, because they pay more attention to the global policy elite, the ones I call the power elite of the world. The 199 directors of the 17 corporations, they all know each other or know of each other, making very similar decisions. They're invested in each other. They all have similar educational backgrounds. 10% of them or so went to Harvard or Princeton, or Stanford, or Oxford. Most more of them. So they're very connected. We think this is, the sociology of global capital. They give advice to the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, the international bank settlements that set policy directions to protect their capital.
And one of the things you point out is that these powerful people, they do this outside of government. These are not elected people, but they're telling elected people what to do. They're telling governments what to do. They're telling armies what to do. They're telling secretaries of state what to do, treasury secretaries. They're behind an awful lot of what decisions are made.
Well, that's the power of these non-profit organizations, policy groups. And I named 3 of them. These are non-governmental groups, but they're very, very important because they're international. The core, what I call the Executive Committee of Global Capital, is the Council of 30. This is Rockefeller funded. It's based in Washington, D.C. It's central bankers from all over the world. There's 32 people on the council. And, they've been around since 78. Their reports are widely accepted and implemented around the globe. So this one small group of 32 people, 31 men and 1 woman, they're from the U.S., 12 are from the U.S., 1 has dual citizenship in Israel, there's 3 are from France, from Ivory Coast, 2 from UK, who are the House of Lords, former president of Mexico, directors of the central banks for Poland, Canada, Spain, Argentina, Italy, Brazil, Switzerland, Japan, India, Singapore, and China. So they meet, they have a staff, they put out reports, and those reports are seen as instructions to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and governments as to what policies have to be implemented.
So is that the same as G30?
That is the G30.
Okay, so the Council of 30 and G30. Okay. So now these are not necessarily billionaires, though. You're describing people who may not have been wealthy at all. I mean.
Well, most of them are pretty wealthy. I mean, if you consider a millionaire wealthy.
Well, yeah, okay. But
almost all of them, their public wealth is well over $1 million or more.
Okay.
They in turn work with what the Trilateral Commission, which is another Rockefeller-funded group set up back in the early 70s, which has over 470 members from all over the world, from most of the countries in the world. And they have an executive committee which does a very similar thing. They're putting out reports. Like in 2013 and 14, the Trilateral Commission put out a report called Engaging Russia, a Return to Containment. And that has set the policy direction of how we've been dealing with Russia and Putin ever since. They said that the Russian invasion of the Crimea, which is sort of I have invasion in quotes because they already had military bases there, was described as a ruthless break with the West and abandoned Gorbachev's vision of joining a common European home. And then they go on to say that Russia always was and will remain different, and that the acceptance of the otherness should be a premise for forming our views in Russia's future and our relationship with her. The nature of Putin's regime permits little more than a transactional U.S.-Russia relationship on a narrow range of issues. Putin's departure from office would produce a transformational moment that portends real systematic change in Russia. So capital elites are salivating over the opportunity to expand capital investment in Russian oil and gas and natural resources in that whole region of the world. And they see that they want to have a regime change in Russia. That's what this is all about.
I'm kind of leaning into this here because I keep thinking, well, this sounds like exactly what Hillary was trying to do. And it sounds like against the narrative, it sounds like Trump is standing up to these people in some ways. And, you know, I really don't think Trump stands up to anybody but himself. But where do Trump and Hillary fit into this? Any idea where they fit into this picture?
Well, Hillary clearly was wanting to challenge the Russians, particularly in Syria. She wanted to put in a no-fly zone. We could have been a war there. But the idea is to undermine Putin in any way possible. That's what they did in the Ukraine. And to, see him out, to have a regime change, bring somebody like Yeltsin back in, allow capital investment in Russia. So Putin, we don't know what the relationship between Putin and Trump is exactly. There's certainly some suspicions there and that sort of thing. But Trump has gone along with these policy recommendations. He certainly has with the Chinese by imposing tariffs on the Chinese products, which the primary demand there in their negotiations that the global capital, be allowed to own over 50% of Chinese companies.
No, wait, you're saying that Trump has basically been doing what these global elites want done?
Yes. I mean, they got the tax return. They got the reinvestments of capital money from overseas without major taxes. They're doing a bank reform so that now these investment banks can go back to the global gambling that they were doing before the collapse in 2008. He's been giving them exactly what they wanted.
And yet you've got all these Trump supporters who are saying, Trump is standing up to the secret bad guys and all. So it sounds to me like what you're saying is he's not doing anything for the people who voted for him. He's doing all this stuff for the global elite. And it looks like maybe we got a frozen screen here. There you go. There you're back. Are you back? No, it's frozen up. Okay, now can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, you froze up for a minute there.
Well, you did too.
So, what I asked you was,
and NSA had to step in.
Maybe it was NSA, yeah. So, just to pick up where I left off, it seems to me that while people are saying that the Trump is standing up to the shadowers or what have you, the secret powers, he's really doing everything that the global elite wants him to do.
I think that that's essentially true. He's a functionary for the global elite. There's probably some people don't like him very much, but clearly the investment bankers and Larry Fink from BlackRock and
We lost you again.
Chase Manhattan.
We lost you. You started.
Are supporting him
Peter,
for his work.
Peter, we lost you again for a second. You started to talk about Larry Fink and BlackRock. Go. Let's pick up from there.
Well, Larry Fink from BlackRock and Jamie Dimon were both on Trump.
Yeah, it's locked up.
They started.
You're locking up.
They were gonna withdraw from the board.
Peter, we're having problems here. I have a feeling this is hold on, I'm gonna put it on pause for a second. Okay, you were telling me about Fink and Dimon. Tell me about those two and who they are.
Fink and Dimon and 15 others were on the president's advisory board, as kind of his industrial advisory board that they formed before he took office. Some of them resigned over the environmental stuff when he withdrew from the Paris Accords, but then others stayed on, and like Jamie Dimon said, well, he's the captain flying our airplane, so we need to support him. But when it came down to Ferguson and some of the racist things Trump was saying, they just couldn't handle it anymore. So they were organizing a protest disbandment, and Trump superseded them and disbanded the whole group.
Okay. So, but let me ask you this. Who are the most powerful people out of government who you describe in your book? The top 2 or 3?
Well, some of the people are like on the Council of 30 and the Executive Committee of the Trilateral Commission. And certainly Jamie Dimon and Larry Fink managing to 2 of them together like $10 trillion worth of capital. But the Group of 30 and the Trilateral Commission are key. So people like Jacob Finkel, who's chair of the J.P. Morgan International. He's on the American International Group. He's on a number of private corporate boards. Professor of economics at the University of Chicago. He's on he's a governor at the International Monetary Fund. He's chair of the Group of 30. He's chair of the Council of Foreign Relations here in the U.S. He's on the Trilateral Commission board, on the World Economic Forum, the New York Economic Club, the Aspen Institute, and a number of other factors. He was educated at the University of Jerusalem, University of Chicago, MA, and PhD in economics. He's a very important person because he's totally interconnected with all of that. Timothy Geithner, former Secretary of Treasury, is very heavily involved. He's president of Warburg Pictures, Pincus, former CEO of, former with the Federal Reserve Board. He was Secretary of Treasurer. He's director of the Council of Foreign Relations. He's on the RAND Corporate Board, the Group 30, World Economic Forum, Trilateral Commission. He goes to Bilderberg. He's a Wall Street Journal CEO, counsel, and he's educated, BA at Dartmouth and MA at Johns Hopkins. About $6 million is his net worth, and that's a very big understatement. So there's a number of people like these people. Jean-Claude Trichet from France. He's part of the Bank of International Settlements, director of Airbus, honorary chair of the Council of 30. He's in the Bilderberg Group. He's a governor of the Bank of France. So these are transnational people. So they're on the central banks and the policy groups worldwide. He's listed by Forbes as one of the top 15 most powerful people in the world.
It's daunting. So you've mentioned the Trilateral Commission. Tell us a bit about that organization.
Well, the Trilateralists were formed by Rockefeller and Brzezinski back in 73. At the time, the Trilateralists meant European, American, and Japanese capitalists. If you're in government, you have to resign from the Trilateral Commission. So they're non-governmental policymakers. There's 400 now that get together annually. And there's an executive committee of about 50 that basically put out reports on a regular basis. So they have a staff, they put out policy reports. They're the ones that made the recommendation on undermining Putin. They are putting out regular recommendations to governments, the World Bank, to everybody, and they have a whole lot of say about what goes on in global capital in the world.
Now, what's the difference between the International Trilateral Commission and the U.S. or American Trilateral Commission?
No, it's just one Trilateral Commission with members from all over. There's a European group, there's an Asian group, and a U.S. group, and then they all meet collectively once a year.
Now, I had on my show a number of years ago, one of the people connected there, Joseph Nye. When I looked him up, I got the impression it said he was like head of the American branch of it, but you're saying there is no such thing?
No, there is. There's a North American center network, there's a European, and there's an Asian.
So what do they each do?
They'll meet separately, but then they all meet together collectively as well. So it's one big organization, but they have branches for regional policies and considerations.
And how does the Trilateral Commission affect us?
Literally everything government does, the military, all of that pays attention to what the Trilateral Commission is recommending. They're setting the agenda. They are core to the global power elite, setting the agenda of what global capital is going to do. And they can recommend regime changes. And, you know, protecting capital is getting rid of people like Gaddafi in Iraq. I mean, just saying it's time to get him out because he was trying to sell oil and gold. And they didn't want to do that.
So they kill people.
Absolutely, they kill people. They use
they overturn governments. They influence elections
across the world. I mean, the U.S. has troops in 150 countries around the world, training or killing people. NATO is right there as their partners in Africa and the Middle East. And their policy, the group that recommends policy for NATO is called the Atlantic Council. And they're national security people and capital investment people together in one private nonprofit advisory group called the Atlantic Council that is setting the recommendation for which governments have to be changed. And the Pentagon pays attention. The CIA pays attention.
I think they do more than pay attention. They obey orders.
They take direction.
Take directions, yes. Okay, so we're going to do a station ID here now. This is the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com, one of the most progressive news and opinion sites you're going to find anywhere. That's opednews.com. The show can be heard on Pacifica Radio, on Progressive Radio Network. You can get it at iTunes at opednews.com/podcasts. And my guest for this show is Peter Phillips. He's the former director of Project Censored. He's a professor of political sociology at Sonoma State University, and he's the author of a new book, Giants, the Global Power Elite. So you, I think, were inspired by C. Wright Mills, one of the founding sociologists. Can you talk about him and his book?
Well, C. Wright Mills was writing in the 50s. He was a Columbia sociologist. And he was setting the standards for after World War II in particular, the idea of a military-industrial complex that Eisenhower later warned us about. He was saying that there were elites in the country who made the decisions about whatever was important. They're the ones that made the decisions what we needed to do. And he said they were military people, they were corporate leaders, and they were government functionaries, but they were all interconnected, and in a number of ways, through various, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Council of Foreign Relations, and different groups in the U.S. So that kicked off studies in sociology of elites, which took a lead in the 60s and the 70s. People like Bill Domhoff were writing books called, The Power Elite. And I was reading that as an undergraduate. So I became interested in that. And when I got to grad school, I went through and did all the research on the elites in the US, and it became clear to me 20 years ago that this was becoming transnational. Leslie Sklar, a sociologist at London School of Economics and Political Science, wrote a book on the transnational capitalist class 18 years ago. And then there were a number of others, including William Robinson, who wrote about the transnational class, and then the crisis that's going on in the world because of what they're doing. And he's the one that wrote the introduction to the book Giants. He's a professor at UC Santa Barbara. And there are a number of others. I mean, William Carroll studied corporate boards and how they've downsized globally and how they're interconnected. And Rothkopf, who worked for Kissinger, he did a book on the transnational elite. So there's been a number of scholars who've written books and journal articles about the transnational class, global elites today. This is over 20 years old. So I'm not just creating or inventing this. It's brand new. I mean, it's not new. It's what's really going on. The difference that this book does is it puts the parameters on who they are. All your friends say they are doing this to us, they're doing that. And I'm saying, well, this is who they are. This is 300 and some people by name who are part of this network that can fix things if they got it in their hearts to do that. And if they don't, then we've got to pressure them and their organizations to make the changes that we need to save the world.
Well, one of my favorite philosophers, activist writers is Paulo Freire.
Yes,
I'm sure you know of him. And, his basic message is that the oppressors and the oppressed are both victims. But only the oppressed can change things. Now, you're saying that I think these guys are the oppressors.
Well, Rob, I think I agree with you in principle. But if we look back at social movement pressures in the 30s, like during the labor movement in the 30s, where the elites in the U.S. were terrified that the communism was going to take over like it had in Russia. And in 1934, there were massive general strikes all over the country, in San Francisco and West Coast being one, with the Longshoremen's Union. There was a number of cities that had civil unrest and resistance. This was the height of the Depression. So that in 1935, the Wagner Act was passed, and the National Labor Relations Act, which gave union workers rights, which they didn't have before, and also Social Security was passed. So these were major legislative compromises that elites were implementing through Congress to deal with the social unrest that was going on in the country because they were afraid of what would happen. We saw the same thing happen back in the 60s during the Civil Rights Movement. We see the Johnson administration putting forth, the Civil Rights Act and the Economic Opportunities Act, both of which were undermined, of course. But
what you're just describing is a bunch of bottom-up protests, scared the hell out of these elites, and so they did what they thought they had to do to stop that.
They will compromise. But it's clear that we're facing a global crisis now that is environmentally destructive and threatens the the elites in even bigger ways than the civil rights movement or the labor movement did in the U.S. And this is global. So they have control of global capital. They could invest. They could tax themselves and create an increased flow of money down to the lowest levels of people in the world. Resources, jobs, housing, food. There's more than enough food to feed everybody in the world. It's not a matter of scarcity. It's a matter of distribution.
I'm sorry. You're not convinced. I mean, I think you're right, but I don't think they'll do it. I think that, Tom Hartman characterizes a lot of billionaires as hoarders. These are pathological people who just want to have as much wealth as they possibly can. They're not going to give away anything to anybody, will they?
I'm not sure. We can have our opinions about who the elite are, how pathological some of them are, and it's probably correct in some cases, but it's also correct that some will want to make some differences in the world that will help, their grandchildren.
So how do we do
What
this?
we have to do is pressure them with political movements of various sorts all over the world, calling for democratic process, increased support for the poorest people, and jobs and into the environmental crisis. If we don't, the world's going to lose it.
Well,
and they will lose it along with it. They're not going to have a spaceship silo somewhere where they're protected when the air we can't breathe it anymore.
Ralph Nader has said something similar. He's written about how we need some billionaires to help save the world. I think this is a top-down rescue fantasy. I don't think these big guys are going to do it. I don't think they're going to change. Now, if we can...
No, we're going to have to force them.
Force them, okay.
We're going to have to force them in many ways. They don't have any choice but to do the right thing. And then they can say, yeah, I support the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I want it better in the world. And then we give them that opportunity. Because they do have resources and they do have control and power in varying degrees.
Are there
But
any...
to completely bring about a revolutionary collapse of the entire system is going to kill millions, if not billions of people.
Are there any of those close to 400 people who you detail about who seem more amenable to making these changes?
Well, I mean, Gates and Soros make a big deal about their philanthropy. Carnegie gave away all of his money at one point, but they get to choose what to do with that money.
Yes.
The idea is that through a democratic bottom-up process, that people get to pick how their resources are used in their own communities. That's what's needed. And how we get there, I don't have a prescription, but I certainly think that that's a vital piece of where we're going, and it's going to have to be bottom-up decision-making.
I think that we have to bite the bullet and make it illegal to be a billionaire. I think we have to make extreme wealth like these people have illegal, and we have to prevent new people from becoming billionaires. No person should inherit $1 million or more dollars.
Well,
anybody who creates a great company should enjoy the pleasure of having done it, and maybe getting millions or hundreds of thousands of workers to have great jobs. But I don't think that should be allowed. I think that we've got to stop that. And I don't think it's an easy thing to do, but I think that that's what it's going to take to change things.
Well, I agree with you. And I think one of the places to start, of course, is to identify who they are.
Yes.
And how much stock they have. I mean, all of these people, we're identifying them specifically. Yes. We're saying what boards they're on. And then we're saying how much public stock they own in these corporations. So they're probably a lot richer than we identify, but all of these people are millionaires or multimillionaires, and there's several billionaires in this group of people, and they're activists. They're policymakers. So that's who this is. The global power elite are the policymakers for global capitalism.
How did you dig up all this information on all these people? Are there resources that other people can access if they want to get into this further? And have you put anything together so that this can become a project for all of us
Well, I give you the foundation. I go and I'll look up their biographies. I'll find out what boards they're on. And a lot of times they're on several boards. So then you go to if they're public companies, they have annual reports. And the annual reports are list their board of directors, how much they're paid, and how much stock they own. So that I went to got their proxy reports for all the corporations. I spent 1,000 hours probably working on these 300 some people. And, so we get that information that tells you their collective worth, and it's not in one place. So if you look at 5 corporations, then we write it down and say, well, you got $1 million a year to sit on 4 boards. And then you've got all this stock that you get for free. And then you have all these options of stock that you can buy for half price kind of thing. And then you're on these policy councils. So of course you have a bias, and you went to school with the same people, and you live in the same city, you belong to the same social networks and cultural networks. And so, okay, this is who you are. And there's got to be a certain uncomfortableness when that gets put together in a book that identifies these people who aren't used to being identified. Bezos gets identified all the time. So does Gates, but they're not the core of the problem. The core of the problem is the sociology, the network of the people that are controlling and this $50 trillion worth of capital, and making policy recommendations for austerity in government and investing in things that are not good for us, like war.
Are you saying,
Coca-Cola, for that God's sake?
Are you saying then that some of these ultra wealthy, the wealthiest people in the world, are not necessarily a part of this mesh of power that you're describing here?
They're all a part of it, but there's the people I'm talking about, the global power elites. They're the activists inside the transnational capitalist class who are engaged in policy making and recommendations to government and military and intelligence services what we need to do. I mean, Bezos can say whatever he wants, but he's not, coming out, that he's not going to get the attention, directly from any governmental organization, other than maybe has some influence. But when you have 200 or 300 people together and it's a policy group and they put out reports that are clearly directed to who the important decision makers are, or they sit on the boards of the World Trade Organization themselves and the central banks of the world, they're the ones going to make those decisions as to what direction we're going. Yeah. So that's what power elite mean, the global power elite. They're organized as activist policymakers.
So I think this is a brilliant, very important book that provides us with tools and resources. But I see it as a kind of a jumping off book that gets us started. It takes us maybe to the beginning of the next level. And I'd just like to know where you'd like to see it, what you'd like to see it produce in the way of a response. How would you like to see it empower people?
Well, we're already seeing things like the Occupy folks in New York were marching to the personal homes of Blankenfield and Fink and saying stop investing in these negative things that are impacting the world. Environmental movements doing the same thing. They're protesting outside their homes. So I'm giving you a list of people around the world that need to be contacted to say you've got to stop investing in these things.
It seems to me,
it could be as simple as the military companies that we're investing in. All of these giant trillion-dollar corporations are invested in Lockheed Martin. I mean, Lockheed Martin's the one that made the bomb that blew up the school bus in Yemen, last week. So, and killed 40 kids. So, State Street has $15 billion invested in Lockheed Martin. Capital Group has $12 billion. Vanguard 6, BlackRock 6. They have, $50 billion, those 17 giants. They have $50 billion invested in Lockheed Martin. They're invested in war. Lockheed Martin's the largest war producer in the world.
You have a
They
take
have
on
22 billion invested in Northrop Grumman. The same thing. And so they all invest anywhere they can get a return with no understanding of the consequences of that bomb blowing up that school bus of children in Yemen.
I disagree. They know. They understand the consequences. They do it in spite of the consequences.
Well, okay. I think that's what I meant to say. I agree with you.
Yeah, they're killers. They're murderers. They're mass murderers.
And you know, the Coca-Cola puts out 1.4 billion plastic bottles a year worldwide.
They can
It takes 400 years for a bottle to deteriorate in the environment. None of that's recycled, or less than 1%. And they're all invested in Coca-Cola. So those are there's negative consequences of their investments that are ruining the world environmentally and militarily, and forcing countries like Greece and Italy and to have austerity, undermining their civilian populations and their governments, and then deliberately undermining countries like Venezuela, trying to get a regime change there, and then lying about it in the corporate media. I mean, the media is the ideological facilitators for the global power elite, the corporate media. And the giants are all invested in the corporate media. So what we're getting top down from television news in particular is, the philosophy that capitalism is wonderful, it does no wrong, nothing could be better, and a complete ignoring or denial of the negative news stories that are emerging worldwide about the consequences.
Now, you say that the corporate media receive 2/3 of their content from PR firms, from these global elite.
Yes.
Where do you get that from?
Ben Bakdickian originally.
Yeah.
And then there's been research that show it's as high as 80%.
80.
So, 20 years ago, Ben Bakdickian told me that, 2/3 of their stories were coming from public relation firms or informed by that. It's got even worse. I mean, there's the three big public relation firms in the world, Omnicom, WPP, and Interpublic Group. They control all the products in any supermarket that you walk into. They're advertising them. They work for government, they work for corporations, they work for non-governmental corporations, and they provide content to the media. So news stories, particularly international stories and national stories, are prepackaged. They're coming out of PR firms that are already paid by the invested interests that they want to see. The only thing you get on television news, 4 o'clock, Channel 4 News Tonight, are auto wrecks, murders, and local, stuff that's going on, and save the kitty stories. The rest is packaged and controlled. It's managed news.
So let's get back to the goal of the book. How would you like people to step off from the information they have in the book? What would you like to see being done? What if this book is fabulously successful in terms of making change happen? What will people and organizations be doing?
Well, I think people can, I hope they understand how concentrated wealth is. And it's not just single wealthy individuals that are to blame here. That wealth capital is very interconnected. It's a cluster of 50, 70 trillion dollars worth of money, closely interconnected and invested, that's controlling the world. And governments and the military and intelligence agencies are protecting capital investments. That's the network. They're protecting capital investments worldwide. They're helping with debt collection if needed, and they're changing regimes that interfere with capital growth and expansion. And we're trying to do that with Russia. We're putting a lot of pressure on China and other countries like Iran and Venezuela that aren't cooperating. We're going to try to undermine them and have regime changes.
Okay, so you're telling us the problem. That's what you're giving us. But what would you like people to do?
One, if we're conscious of who is doing this, then they can be identified and we can pressure them. We can identify, how corporate power investments work. We can ask them to tax themselves and allow massive amounts of money to trickle down into the coffers of community groups everywhere in the world to stop starvation, to stop environmental damage, to create a humanitarian world. Those are my overall goals. How we get there, I don't have the particulars, but any social movement, any political movement, any political party can incorporate the moral code of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as their fundamental agreed thing. I mean, we don't teach that, and we need to, because 70 years ago, committees of people at the UN spent 2 years figuring out what the Declaration of human rights were, because they just come out of World War II and it was devastating. Millions and millions of people died. They wanted to try to prevent that from happening again. We're nowhere near implementing that, and it never was a treaty. It was simply a moral code. So I say, okay, let's agree on this moral code. Let's use it to inform ourselves of what we agree on and where we want to see the world go. And then we've got to put pressure on governments and these elites to help make that happen. And if they won't, then we're going to have to make it happen. And I prefer nonviolent, methods of protest and non-cooperation. I think are important. I think Gandhi was important. But ultimately, these giants, they have power, not only military power, but they have private military power. I have a whole section of the book on G4S, which is the largest private security company in the world. They're the second largest employer in the world, private employer, behind Walmart, with 620,000 employees. And they manage prisons, they manage security in banks for countries, and they have mercenaries who can go kill people anywhere in the world. So that's privatized military.
And privatization is a big part of the agenda of this group.
Because they have so much capital, they need to continue to privatize. And privatize state parks, privatize roads, privatize churches, privatize schools, everything.
Like that monument in Utah that Trump just shrunk in size so it could be privatized.
Right, the entire, yeah.
Again, Trump is doing what they're asking.
Can you talk a little louder? I'm not hearing you good.
Again, Trump is doing what they are asking.
Trump is a functionary for the global power elite. He's doing exactly what they ask. They're a little probably worried about him because he's kind of reckless and they don't want to have a nuclear war, but so right now he's making them tons of money.
Amazing. So, oh God. You also talk in the book about resistance. What kind of resistance do you have in mind?
Well, we all resist in a variety of ways. You by doing this show, me by writing these books. But, there's the Bolivarian resistance that's going on in South America, which is widespread. There's, an increased awareness of what socialism is among the new millennium people in the U.S. So there's a variety, and there's certainly environmental movements that are challenging gas and oil companies in very big ways. So there's a lot of different social protest movements. There's a big prison resistance right now in the country to say ending prison labor, and prisoners around all over the U.S. are sitting down and not cooperating with their institutions. So there's a lot of resistance in a variety of ways. That is going to continue.
Now, you mentioned the Bolivarian resistance in South America. Talk a little bit about that, because I think what's happened down there is that has been crushed massively by the CIA, by undermining elections. So talk about the movement.
Well, we continue to do that. They'll continue to put money into different governments. They tried to assassinate Maduro, 2 weeks ago. And so whatever parties, if there's an open party in Ecuador, there's been some transition. Chile has always been fairly right-wing. But there's been increasing successes from the bottom up in Brazil, in Bolivia, resistance to capital investment there in a variety of ways, and big problems in throughout Latin America. There's right-wing governments, and there's some that are fairly progressive, but the U.S. and capital through the Central Intelligence Agencies and global intelligence agencies from other countries around the world that cooperatively work together, they can spend huge amounts of money trying to influence elections and change things. And so the idea that the Russians somehow got Trump in is ludicrous. I mean, compared to what we're doing.
You took the words right out of my mouth. Yeah. So we've got about 3 or 4 more minutes. What do you want to talk about?
Well, I think partly I wrote this book, and I spent 5 years of my life literally preparing. I mean, my whole life has been preparing for it, but particularly the last 2 years, I put thousands of hours in putting the content there. So I really hope it gets out there, gets used and expanded and developed and recognized. It's pretty darn accurate, and identifies who these people are and what they're doing and how they do it. So having that consciousness emerge, that belief out there, I think it is vital, and that more research will be done in the future on these folks and the global power elite, and recognizing that it's a top-down world in terms of capital control and military and governments, and that if we're going to have a democracy or citizen-based societies where we're making our own decisions, we're going to have to take it ourselves and work with it. So I think there's a variety of things that we can do in that capacity.
One thing I want to add, your publisher is 7 Stories Press. It's a small press. This is a big book. It's expensive to make a book like this. And I just want to give them some credit. It's a courageous book, too, for you to do and for this publisher to do, 7 Stories Press. I just think it's great.
Well, Dan Simon of 7 Stories has been supported. This is my 18th book with them. I did 14 of the Project Censored books, which was one way of I was informed about so much of the misinformation in the world, or what wasn't covered by the media. Set the foundational roots, and plus my graduate school research on elites kind of led me in the direction of producing this book and laying it out.
No, it's a great book. And thanks so much for being on the show. This has been the Rob Call Bottom Up Show. You've been listening to my guest, Peter Phillips, the author of a new book, Giants, the Global Power Elite.